A Dog's Life, The Autobiography of a Stray, by Anne M. Martin, published by Scholastic Press. Part 4. Old Woman. Cold. The cold came early that winter when I knew with certainty that I was an old dog. No early snow, though, not like the winter Moon and I had spent in Claremont, but there was plenty of cold, and there were storms that flung sleet and ice out of the clouds, stinging my skin and eyes. I was living at the edge of a town then, my instincts telling me it was time to find a farm for the winter, my old bones protesting at the prospect of the journey. The first of the ice storms came one frigid night, causing schools to be closed the next day, which was Halloween. I had learned that children generally enjoy an unexpected day off from school, but the ones I saw in their yards on Halloween morning were not happy. "No trick-or-treating tonight," I heard the parents say. "It's icy, too dangerous to go out." I had spent the night in the shelter of an up-ended wheelbarrow in someone's backyard. I was dry, but I was so cold I was shaking, and I hadn't eaten since the morning before. Still, I stayed in my shelter until the next day, when the air warmed and the ice started to melt. I waited until the people who lived in the house with the wheelbarrow had left. Then I walked out of their neighborhood and into some woods. I traveled for 2 days and 2 nights. My limbs felt heavy. They no longer moved with ease. Some days they were stiff. Most days they were just plain slow. I was almost always hungry and thirsty. Sometimes I was so hungry that I couldn't even feel the hunger pangs. Hunting had become difficult because my reflexes weren't what they used to be. I wasn't fast enough to catch most animals unless they were unsuspecting. I needed to rely on garbage. But garbage was easier to find in towns, and I had not forgotten the animal control officers. One morning I woke up in the gray dawn, shivering in a hollow under an outcropping of rock. I noticed that my hind foot was bleeding. I licked it, then rose unsteadily and set off walking again. I wasn't sure when I had last eaten, only that I needed to find a farm soon. But I walked all day and saw no farms. I was in the country, and I saw an isolated house here and there, but not a single farm. I fell asleep that night dreaming of Jean and Hal, of the horse and cows and cats and geese, of the warm barn and the compost heap. When I awoke the next morning, stiff and freezing and famished and thirsty, I set out again. I didn't bother to stick to the woods. I was too tired. I walked down a country road. When a car or truck rumbled by, I stepped out of the way, but I didn't hide. I traveled this way for 2 more days, eating an already dead squirrel I found in the road and drinking bad-tasting ditch water. And then the first snow fell. It began late in the afternoon, just before the winter darkness seeped in. I stopped walking and flopped down on my haunches, out of breath and shivering. I looked around. Only one house was nearby. A long drive led from the road to the side of the house, and a path led from the drive to the front porch. The house was white with black shutters. The yard was tidy. Lights glowed in 2 of the windows, and good scents came to my nose. I smelled food, and I smelled smoke, which I realized I could see curling out of the chimney. I turned and walked up the drive, leaving bloody footprints behind me in the snow. When I reached the house, I looked behind it and saw a tool shed. I checked the shed and found the door open. I nosed my way inside. The shed was my shelter for the night. The air inside was cold but dry, and when I peered outside the next morning, I saw that the snow had stopped falling. I tiptoed out of the shed and around to the front of the house. I was sitting underneath a yew bush when a woman stepped onto the porch. She was old. I know the human signs of old age. Her hair was white, her face was wrinkled, and she moved as slowly and stiffly as I did. But her face looked kind, and she smiled as she tossed some birdseed onto the ground, glanced at the brightening sky, then slipped inside again. As soon as the door had closed, I made my way to the seed. I was eating it in great big gulps when I heard the door open again. I ran around to the side of the house, and I heard the woman say, "Oh my, a dog!" I hid in the shed until the afternoon, then returned to the birdseed. Not much was left, but I snuffled up what I could find. I was still snuffling and searching through the snow when the door creaked open. I raised my head, and the old woman poked her own head around the door. "Good afternoon, dog," she said. I ran back to the shed. Behind me I could hear the woman calling, "Where are you going? Are you hungry?" I was hungry. I thought maybe I'd never been hungrier in all my life. And so that evening, as I lay in the shed long after the dark had come, I paid attention when I heard a noise from the back of the woman's house. It sounded like a door opening and closing. I peeked out of the shed. The lights in the house were winking off, and soon the house was bathed only in moonlight. I crept to the stoop by the back door, and there before me were two bowls. One was full of water, the other was full of chicken and gravy and mashed potatoes. I slurped up the food, licked the bowl clean, and drank half the water before returning to the shed. The next morning I was peeping out of the shed when the back door opened. I froze in place and watched the stoop. The old woman stepped outside and peered at the dishes. My, she was hungry, she said. Not a crumb left. She carried the dishes inside. A few moments later she set them out again. I waited a bit before venturing to the stoop. The water dish had been refilled, and the food dish now contained turkey, cheese, and rice. I gobbled up the food, drank some of the water, and hurried to the shed. That night I found more food in the dish, and the next morning too. On the day after that, the woman put food in the dishes in the afternoon as well as in the morning and the evening. On the day after that, I arose early and waited in the shed for breakfast. Sure enough, as I watched, the door opened, and the woman stepped outside, gathered up the empty dishes, and soon returned with full ones, which she left on the stoop, closing the door after her. I was chomping on a piece of steak when the door opened a crack, and there was the woman standing in the doorway. I stiffened, then backed up, and the woman said, "Oh, now, for heaven's sake, dog, you must be as old as I am. Why don't you come inside and warm up?" But I ran off, leaving several mouthfuls of good steak behind, and I skipped lunch, waiting for darkness before I ate again. I didn't want to skip breakfast the next day, though. There had been more steak for dinner. And while I was eating the bowl of scrambled eggs and bacon that I found waiting for me, as I stood on a stranger's stoop in broad daylight, there came the turn of a knob, the click of the door. I backed away from the food. "Come on, old dog," the woman said. "Enough of this silliness." I retreated in the direction of the shed. "You know," the woman continued, "the last thing I need is a dog, but I really think you ought to come inside. You must be freezing." I put my tail between my legs and kept walking. "That shed isn't very warm," called the woman. "Not warm at all. If you come inside, you can sit by the fire." But I couldn't do it. I could not go into her house. Not until the morning, when the air was so bitterly cold that I couldn't feel the bottoms of my paws. On that morning I shivered as I ate the chicken that had been set out. The woman came to the door and watched me. I didn't run away, just stood over the bowl, shaking and trying to swallow. "Old dog, for goodness sake, you are a mess. I can see your ribs, you're shivering, and your feet are bleeding. You look like you can barely stand up. Please come inside." She held the door open for me. I raised my head. I could feel the warmth from her house. I could smell the wood smoke and hamburger, good food smells. I looked back at the bowl, down at my feet, my frozen feet. I thought of Marcy and George, of the shouting and swatting the night in the box. I thought of the Beckers and my dusty bed in the garage. But then I thought of Matthias and Dr. Roth and Rachel. I stepped through the doorway and into the old woman's house. Addie. The woman led me through a narrow hallway and into a big, bright room with a fire burning behind a grate. "Now you sit there, dog, and warm yourself. I'm going to get some blankets for you." The woman pushed my rump down until I was sitting before the fire. I looked around a room at the couch and chairs, at a low table with a bowl of flowers resting in the middle, at the framed pictures on the walls. The colors in the room were soft, the fire was warm, the room felt safe. I heaved a sigh. "I heard that, dog," said the woman as she returned with an armload of blankets. "You deserve to let out a sigh like that, a great big sigh. I can tell that you've seen a lot and done a lot, and now you're very tired." The woman arranged the blankets in a sort of nest next to me. "Okay," she said, "now you rest here." She patted the blankets, and I stepped onto them. The woman sat down heavily in an armchair. "Ooh," she said, "my knees don't work the way they used to. I'm not much good at stooping any more." She paused. "Well, dog," she continued, "I suppose I ought to introduce myself. My name is Susan McGrath." I expect you have a dog name of your own, but I don't know what it is, so I'm going to call you Addie. Unless it turns out that you're a boy, in which case I'll have to think of a different name. But I've been watching you for days now, and I have a feeling you're a girl, and Addie seems to suit you. Today, since you're not feeling well, I'm going to put your food and water dishes right here by the fire. When you're feeling better, you can eat in the kitchen with me. Susan rose slowly and walked out of the room, talking to herself. I'll have to call the vet, I could hear her say. Make an appointment for Addie. Goodness, it must be 3 years since I last called that office. I wonder if Skip is still there. Susan's voice faded away. I stretched my front legs in front of me and rested my chin on them. I closed my eyes, feeling the warmth from the fire curl over me like a nest of leaves. I didn't open my eyes again until Susan returned, carrying the water bowl and the dish of chicken that had been outside on the stoop. She placed them next to me. Here you go, Addie, she said, breakfast in bed. I took a drink of water and finished the chicken. Susan watched me from her chair, then pulled a footstool to the hearth and sat beside me. Do you mind if I pat you, Addie? She asked. I don't want to frighten you. Susan held her hand toward my snout. I sniffed her fingers, then I gave them a small lick. Ah, you're a kisser, said Susan. That's fine. She scratched me under my chin, then ran her hands slowly along my back. Good girl, she said. Good girl. I rested by the fire for a long time that day. I was too tired to feel nervous or afraid. Besides, Susan was as kind and as gentle as Rachel and Dr. Roth had been. Every now and then she would stir the fire or add another log to it. When she did, she spoke softly to me. Sorry to disturb you, Addie, but I want to keep the fire going. I want you to stay warm. Susan was a busy person. I kept my eye on her when I wasn't sleeping. She fixed herself lunch, which she ate in her chair in the living room, feeding me bites from time to time. I don't usually eat in here, she told me, but today is special. After lunch, she sat at a desk and wrote with a pen and opened up envelopes and sealed up other envelopes and sorted through a stack of papers saying, junk, junk, junk. Ooh, this is important. I'd better keep it. More junk, keep. Send to Betsy, junk. And then suddenly she exclaimed, my goodness, I forgot about calling the vet. She reached for the telephone. Hello, she said a moment later. This is Susan McGrath. I haven't called here in a while. She paused, listening. Yes, that's right. Yes. Well, I seem to have found a stray dog, an old stray dog, or she found me. Anyway, I think Dr. Thompson should look at her pretty soon. She probably just needs good food and a home, but I want to make sure she isn't sick. Tomorrow? That would be fine. Okay, we'll see you then. Susan hung up the phone and turned to me. You're going to have a big day tomorrow, Addie. I have errands to run, and you can come with me. I think we'll go to the pet store. There's a good new one in town, and then, well, I'm not going to lie to you. When we have finished our errands, we'll be off to the vet. You'll like Skip, though. That's Dr. Thompson. My last dog did. Maxie, my old Maxie. Dr. Thompson will give you a cookie, Addie. Susan tidied the papers on her desk and put her pen in a holder. Then she rose, walked through the room and into a hallway and opened the door to a closet. Now, where is that leash? I heard her say. She hauled a bag out of the closet and pawed through it, then put it back. She hauled out another bag and said, aha, here we go. I raised my head and watched Susan remove several items from the bag. A collar that looked like the one I had worn when I was Daisy and lived in the Becker's garage, a leash, a rubber ball, and a cloth toy in the shape of a cat. Susan brought the things back to me, laid the ball and the cat on the blankets, and said, May I fasten this collar around you, Addie? I wonder if you've ever worn one of these. You'll have to get used to it. I felt Susan's hands clip the collar around my neck. Then she attached the leash to the collar. I imagine you must have to go to the bathroom by now, she said. I know you don't want to leave the fire, but we have to get you outside for a few minutes. Just a few minutes, I promise. Susan tugged at the leash and I got to my feet. I let her lead me outdoors. We walked around her house until I relieved myself near the yew bush by the front door. As soon as I was finished, Susan exclaimed, Oh, good girl, Addie, good girl. And then she gave me a biscuit. We're off to a great start. Later that afternoon, as I rested by the fire again, and Susan sat nearby in her armchair, the phone rang. Hello, said Susan. There was a short pause before she went on. Oh, hello, Mrs. Oliver. I glanced at Susan. Her face had changed. It didn't look as soft as it had before the phone rang. Well, I'm just fine. Thank you for asking. Yes, I know it's chilly today, very chilly. No, I can't think of a thing you can get me. I'm going to go into town tomorrow. Safe to drive? Of course it's safe to drive. All the roads have been plowed. I've been driving myself for 66 years now, since before you were born." There was a very long pause, during which Susan straightened the cushions on the couch, wiped some crumbs off of a table, and made a face at the phone. Then suddenly she cried, "Sell this place? Absolutely not. I can manage just fine." A moment later she added, "I am not snippy." And then, "Oh, there's the doorbell. I have to go. Bye." The doorbell had not rung. Susan hung up the phone and walked into the kitchen, grumbling, "Who on earth does Mrs. Oliver think she is? Half my age, and she calls me dear. And since when is my business hers?" I could hear Susan making banging noises in the kitchen, and thought of Marcy and George. But when Susan returned to her armchair, she was carrying a cup of tea and smiling a little, and she said softly, "I'm sorry I lost my temper, Addie. That woman makes me so mad, but it doesn't have anything to do with you." She patted my back, and then we sat together in the quiet house, and I watched snow start to fall on the other side of the windows. That evening Susan fixed turkey and peas for supper, and we ate together by the fire. But then Susan let the fire die out. "It's not safe to leave it burning during the night," she said to me as the flames flickered and grew smaller. "But I want you to be warm, so I'm going to move your bed into the kitchen. You can sleep in front of the radiator, all right?" And that is exactly what I did. After Susan clipped the leash on me and took me outside one more time, she led me into the kitchen, and I lay down on my nest of blankets. The snow had stopped falling, but the outside air had been damp and cold, frosty enough to see our breath. I lay gratefully by the radiator. Susan turned off the light in the kitchen, then in the living room, and called to me, "Good night, Addie. Sleep well. I'll see you in the morning." And I slept warmly all that winter night.